This is I Have No Title and I Must Podcast, the show where we discuss any and all aspects of pop culture that is on our mind at the time, and sometimes we even stay on topic. I'm your host, Tyler.
And Chris.
And before we get into it, we got a little bit of an announcement. We are starting to do a secondary show. This will be a movie review of both new releases and retro movies. So we don't know a release schedule for that yet, so keep an eye out. Also, comment and let us know what movies are on the horizon you want us to see, or any old movies that you want to hear our take on. The first review we're doing is the new Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse. So yeah, stay tuned for that.
And we're talking about doing some commentaries that'll be, you'll have to queue it up on your home player and then play our commentary simultaneously. But if there's any movies that you would like to hear us do a commentary on other than Mac and me, let us know.
All experimental right now, so any suggestions will be appreciated.
All right, what are we talking about this week?
Keeping theme with the new Spider-Verse coming out, let's talk Spider-Man.
What was your first memory of Spider-Man?
Well, it's the animated series, because
that's a good one.
Yeah, from the 90s. I need to specify that.
Yes, there's been a lot.
There's several.
When you say the animated series, for me, my mind goes to that teal, yes, white, and purple shirt are iconically tied to Peter Parker for me.
Yes.
That's where my mind goes, but there's been dozens, and I think some more recent ones are probably where some kids are going to be thinking these days, so we should specify the 90s yes, animated series.
But I didn't have an access to a lot of the comic books because there wasn't really a comic book shop where I was growing up. We had a bookstore that had maybe 2 sections for comic books. And one was trade paperbacks and manga, with the other one being new releases. And even then, small selection. So I didn't read a lot of the comics. So for me, Spider-Man was the animated series.
I stand by that series. I think it holds up.
Yes.
All the way to the end with the original Spider-Verse, and it is. They had some really great versions of Spider-Man from some What If comics, and the antagonist, the real villain of that, threatens to destroy the entire multiverse. That's bigger than what Davros is attempting in Journey's End of Doctor Who, the season 4 finale, which, well, actually, it's about the same. But they did it first.
But yeah, it's definitely an animated series. And when I told Chris that I was doing research for this episode, yeah, it was just me watching the animated series.
I did real research.
Yeah.
But that TV show is good enough research, I guess. My first memory of it was getting the Secret Wars action figure. They made 2. They made the black costume and the regular one, with those little, if anybody remembers or just has seen the figures on Instagram or whatever, they had, each of the figures came with a shield that had like a little lenticular changing image. Don't remember what his was, but he had a little shield that came with him. I had the Doctor Doom, Spider-Man, Captain America. My dad would get them for me. I mean, I don't remember being old enough to like actively, like 3 or 4. You're not going out and saying like, oh, have you read the new Dickens this week? I'll pick up the new issue of Spider-Man. No, I couldn't just go out and get whatever. So my dad would get me stuff and then explain it to me, or if I'd said like, what can this guy do? He would be like, oh, well, he can stick to walls. He's a Spider-Man after all, and he can shoot webs. And what can this guy do? He's got metal claws that come out of his, in between his knuckles. Pretty cool. So eventually I would read some random issues. I really loved his what ifs. I loved the what if story, or comic series. Not all of them are winners, but I just love the idea of it, especially the really hardcore, brutal ones that are like Twilight Zone episodes. And some of my favorite memories of Spider-Man that I think really, so just like with Batman, I think one of the definitive versions that everyone can agree with about Batman is that 90s animated series. I feel the same way about Spider-Man. It condenses a lot of his greatest storylines into easily digestible episodes.
But, even on the rewatch, I'm like, this was easy for me to understand as a kid, but there's a lot going on that I'm like, even as an adult now, I'm like, this has still got something.
Yeah, I feel like it was one of those that trod that line that's obviously, it's got action for kids, and they did have to follow a certain kind of code that he wasn't allowed to like punch people, and they couldn't have real guns.
All the guns are laser guns.
Yeah, but the storylines, it's like I tuned in. I remember just catching it randomly when one of the last times I remember seeing it on. And it was like one of the latter episodes they got into like
the Clone Saga.
I think so, where it's like one of the it might have been like the episode title was like Sins of the Father, which is still kind of like poetic, like kids aren't gonna get that, but like the episode part was like triple Roman numerals or something. And I was like, how many episodes into this are they? Like, how complicated is this storyline? Clearly this was meant for family. Like, I shudder to say like fathers and sons. Like, I want moms and daughters and I want everybody to be able to watch this. And I feel like they can. It might not pass the Bechdel test though. Anyway, Spider-Man's awesome and this show was awesome. Who is Spider-Man?
I guess it depends on which comic you're reading. So it could be Peter Parker. It could be Miles Morales. It could be guy that did Spider-Man 2099, that name I should remember, but it's already lost me.
Since we just recorded the review for Across the Spider-Verse 5 minutes ago, I just said Miguel O'Hara like twice in that. So it's Miguel O'Hara, played by the incomparable Oscar Isaac. For today's podcast, let's simplify things and just stick with the original 616 Peter Parker, if you don't mind.
Okay.
Because if anyone's been listening, and I know you have, Tyler, you're very attentive, and I appreciate that, I have a tendency to get off topic. Our listeners, they will have noticed that it happens. They will think that I'm doing it intentionally for the purposes of being funny. That's not the case. I have a problem.
It's like a Bob Ross painting. It's a happy little accident.
Yeah. So, Spider-Man is Peter Parker. His first appearance was in 1962 in what was going to be a throwaway comic. It was in one of those anthology comics called Amazing Fantasy. I think it was issue 15. I should know this off the top of my head. They did those types of comics at the time, like the original detective comics or Strange Tales or action comics, used to just be throw the kitchen sink in. It would be like a few pages of some random detective guy, and then it would have some twist ending. And that was it. And you would never see that character ever again, except sometimes you get a Thor. And he kind of takes over that comic. Or in detective comics, it used to be about detectives in comics. Then eventually there was Batman, and eventually he took over, and it wasn't about any of the other guys anymore. Amazing Fantasy was coming to an end. Stan Lee had an idea for it was actually kind of revolutionary at the time because Spider-Man was going to be a teenager. Teenagers weren't the title characters, they were sidekicks. So especially to have him have a different physique, then this isn't ever talked about. A lot of other critiques I've heard, they don't mention it because when Jack Kirby drew the original one, the original design for Spider-Man, it was more like bursting at the seams, like a Superman or a Batman. And Stan knew that that's not where he wanted to go with it. So they made him slender, and that's where they wanted to keep him is, he's a teenager. He's younger. The costume, that's a different story. But he put it in the Amazing Fantasy final issue. The line had already been canceled, but people wanted to see it. And that was back when they read the letters that people wrote in. And they eventually put Spider-Man back out in his own comic. And it kind of took off, or at least the concept of it did, as now, for a lot of people, Peter Parker isn't really the main Spider-Man anymore, or shares the title with a lot of other people, but it is still, there's, especially in the mainline MCU, there are two main Spider-Men, Miles and Peter. So, I did want to talk about the creation of this character. Obviously, it was co-created. This is when Stan Lee is asked, because it was one of Stan Lee's ideas. There was an original, noir kind of character from the 30s, I think, called, from one of those other random comic book companies, called the Spider. Very similar to the Green Hornet or the Shadow. In fact, more recently, I think Dynamite Comics did a line where they brought some of these classic, maybe unknown characters back to life and even had them all team up. So Stan remembered that. He was just called the Spider, had a similar mask, but for the most part, it was like a black version of Green Hornet or the Shadow. He used guns. There were no spider powers or whatever. So Stan wanted a spider-powered person. So a Spider thought, yeah, that, sure. So when asked directly who came up with the look or the design, he doesn't hesitate to say, that was Steve Ditko. Except maybe not, because almost a decade prior to that, there was a costume company that put out, and you can look this up. We can maybe post some links for some images, or even Scott Nicewander's old video on YouTube that really does a deep dive on this. NerdSync. There was this costume that bears a striking resemblance to Spider-Man's costume, like the modern one. There was a lot of yellow in it. Not much to say about this. He claims, Scott Nicewander claims he doesn't really see that there's enough of a similarity to it. Render these in grayscale. I think they look quite similar. Does that mean Steve Ditko copied it? I'm not going to come out and say that. That's all.
That was something that I was unaware of, was the whole costume thing. It's like I knew his first appearance and, the whole Ditko thing, because I know people ask Stan Lee all the time, hey, can you draw Spider-Man? He's like, not really.
Yeah.
It's like, but here you go.
And that's not even to mention that, like, he had originally asked Jack Kirby, another co-creator and partner of his, to take a stab at it before Ditko. And he wasn't happy with what Kirby drew, so he turned to Steve Ditko. And that's the design that stands to this day, except for give or take the arm web wings. Having said that, later on, I think in the 80s or 90s, Kirby would come out and say, I created Spider-Man. They let Steve Ditko have the credit, but I came up with the design. Who knows? To this day, who knows?
I know there's a lot of discrepancy with that stuff, or at least Jack Kirby not getting
enough credit.
Yeah.
And that's, and that was something else that Steve Ditko would cite is why he left Marvel and went to DC.
And I don't know if that was intentional on someone's part or just an oversight.
Well, and that's, we look at Steve Ditko and Jack Kirby would go back and forth and specifically went to DC, citing they don't recognize the creators, they don't give them enough credit, they don't give them enough money. But just look at Bill Finger. There's entire documentaries dedicated to uncovering the fact that Batman was co-created not just by Bob Kane, but also Bill Finger. And they've had to retroactively give this guy died penniless because of DC. So I think people forget about that. DC are big heroes. No, comic books industry is a tough one on artists and writers and any kind of creator. If it's a corporation, you're most likely, you have to protect your intellectual property. Don't sign it away.
Because, I wouldn't be surprised right now, because I know everybody knows Stan Lee, but I say there's a lot of people that when we say Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko, they're like, who?
Yeah. Steve Ditko created, or co-created also Doctor Strange and Mr. A. Yeah, don't think I forgot about Mr. A.
Pretty much any big comic book from Marvel in the 60s and 70s, probably Jack Kirby co-created.
Mm-hmm.
Early
he kind
X-Men.
of recreated the design. There was a certain look that followed, especially from like the 50s to the 60s when, as like that 61 to 63 era when everything kind of hit. DC already had like a lot of their heavy hitters from further back, but then Marvel, especially after Stan Lee started, gaining more and more creative control and power, and you had Doctor Strange, Daredevil, Fantastic Four, X-Men, Spider-Man, and the Avengers, like all came out within such a short amount of time. And we think about the cultural impact that's had to this day, just in the past, from like 2008 when Iron Man came out, and there were people who said Iron Man, that's a C-list character. Like, he had a cartoon in the 90s. And he's been around all this time, one of the mainline Avengers since, I want to say 62. I do forget when when his first appearance was, 61, 62. But yeah, so Jack Kirby's influence is still one above all.
Yeah. Wink.
I did want to take a moment and talk about Steve Ditko being the co-creator of Spider-Man. Stan Lee gets talked to death, and he's got a new documentary coming out. I will see it, but Stan has gotten enough credit, gotten enough exposure. I think even at this point, Stan would agree and say, let's talk about Steve for a second. An Ayn Rand fanatic that became, Stan never shied away from a microphone or a camera in his life. Steve Ditko, the opposite. He would not give interviews and would say that his work would speak for itself, and his character, Mr. A, would be his defining contribution to society. A character that views everything black and white. It's either good or bad. That's it. He wore a mask that was a white version of his own face. You can't make this stuff up. In fact, you can. Steve Ditko did. And it's not even like, Ayn Rand's view on things. It's complicated now, like looking at it in the modern era, because conservative to liberal spectrum, you have certain things that are religiously based on the conservative side, like their no abortions policy. She was very pro-abortion. Having said that, a lot of her other views are traditionally, like in the modern term, more conservative. Just looking at saying men, to make yourself happy is the greatest accomplishment you can have. I don't know, it's weird. Anyway, Steve Ditko's interpretation of this is good is good, bad is bad, and there is no shade of gray and no in between. If you add shades of gray, you're only going to pull down a good man. So in his view, an anti-hero would not exist. I assume he would not give interviews to clarify. There was only a few times he actually even wrote for anything that would be like a personal letter to himself. He was asked about the Spider-Man thing, the costume, like if he stole that from the costume company that had already had a costume out almost 10 years prior to that. And I think he said like the work speaks for itself or some other bullshit that sounds like I know what he said. The burden of proof is on the person presenting the thing or whatever. And that's almost just like saying, I got my money. All of y'all. Also, I am perfectly good because I believe that. And I am the ultimate judge on that because I'm a fan of Ayn Rand. Anyway, read some books, guys. You're not going to be happy with what you see. A lot of people objectively say the Mr. A books are objectively bad because they're written badly and maybe not even drawn the best. I think they're all black and white and they're all like little morality tales where it's just like if someone in his view does something morally ambiguous, then he has zero obligation to even save them. You'll often see a hero in the story, when the bad guy starts to slip off the cliff, you grab him and you say like, grab my hand. And then they're just like, I'm done here. I've seen the error of my ways. And they let go and the hero acts like, oh no, I let the bad guy die. And then us as the audience are like, I mean, yeah, but what were you going to do with him if you saved him? Steve Ditko would argue that is exactly what they should have done, except they should have just let go sooner because bad people deserve to die. But as we know,
only Sith deal in absolutes.
Only a Sith deals in absolutes. So you read my mind, and that's Steve Ditko in a nutshell. I would say go read some books again, but don't read Mr. A because it probably sucks. And there are several synopsis videos on YouTube. If you just type in Steve Ditko, Mr. A, the top two will be good enough. I should mention those in the comments. I will go back and look. A bit dry, but a good take nonetheless. If you're interested in the research that I had to do for this, if you're interested in seeing where Steve Ditko came from, some of these artists are also writers. Some of the writers are also artists. If you want to be an autonomous being, it's good to branch out and have multiple talents. A lot of you already do. So, something to look into. Some people are good at magic and podcasting. I'm good at neither. Anyway, carry on.
And if you want to see the research I have done, the animated series is on Disney Plus.
And that's a great show. I still love that. I love the ending to it. They build up to that. Yeah, the original Spider-Verse.
The original Spider-Verse was my action figure collection. Because I was doing that long before I knew what a Spider-Verse was. I just had all the different iterations of Spider-Man. They were on a team against all the bad guys that I had.
Do you remember, what's your favorite Spider-Man movie?
Movie? It's a harder one. Because there's still two I've not seen yet.
What's your favorite Spider-Man actor? I think mine is still Garfield. I think him as the embodiment of the character. I think Tobey Maguire did okay. And I love Sam Raimi's cinematography. But I never really liked the casting in that, the core cast of that. The villains were great for the most part in those films. And I don't want to be too harsh on Tobey. I loved seeing him back in No Way Home. Yeah. But I think Garfield for me, and I mean, Tom Holland's really good too, and closer to that age and size.
I would like to see what Garfield was going to do. I feel like they did him dirty on those.
Yeah, they for sure did.
Because,
behind the scenes.
Because the first movie wasn't terrible that he did. But I feel that the deleted scenes, had they stayed in the movie, would have made a more compelling movie. Because the Lizard is a very nuanced character. It's not just a mindless beast. He's also the human Kurt Connors, as we discussed before. And I feel that the deleted scenes showed that. And so it made a more complex movie because it had a more complex character. But that was cut out. So it was just Spider-Man versus the monster.
Mm-hmm.
Which, you know, if that's what you want, I guess it's fine. But, I mean, there's just so much more to explore there. And they did explore it. They just cut it out.
Yeah, and there was a Mary Jane, right? Like, they had a cast Mary Jane, and they had filmed scenes that they just completely dropped that storyline, I think, in the second one. I liked watching him put together the web shooters, the trial and error with that. I like seeing it when he messes up, because it makes it, when he actually succeeds, all the better. I think he's a better... Spider-Man's funny. He's supposed to be funny. They even say this in Across the Spider-Verse. In every universe, Spider-Man's supposed to be funny. And Tobey Maguire wasn't. He got one quip in 3 films. And that was when he webbed J. Jonah Jameson's mouth and said, "Quiet, the adults are talking," or something like that. It was good, but it could have been so much better if it fit. Because it didn't really fit that Spider-Man. Garfield was funny all the way through as Garfield, as Spider-Man. No, as Garfield. As Peter Parker.
Yeah, as we all know, because Spider-Man hates Mondays.
He does.
But yeah, and just the second movie, I felt like they just tried to put too much into what they had. Too many villains.
The TASM, the Amazing Spider-Man.
Yeah, the second Garfield movie. I mean, it would have been great to have worked up to Sinister Six, but instead of trying to shove all the villains into one movie without giving them their time to shine, to why we care, instead of just like, this is a gobbled mess.
Yeah.
And that's what we got.
Those two get a lot of flack, but honestly, I enjoyed them for what they were. I think Garfield's actually a great Spider-Man. It's like kind of dark at times, and he's still funny. I think the modern MCU, what would come at around that time or after, they've been moved, and they really need to be careful about this. And this is what happened with Thor 4. Thor 3 trod that line, and it was great. It was an action comedy. Thor 4 is just a comedy with some action thrown in, and the comedy doesn't work as well as I think they'd like for it to. They drank their own Kool-Aid with that. They got a little too hubristic. Spider-Man, who is supposed to be funny, gets his show stolen by Tony Stark in Homecoming. Tom Holland isn't nearly as funny as I think he could be. Some of it's the actor and some of it's the writing. Robert Downey Jr., naturally charismatic, naturally funny, naturally compelling all the time. He brought all of that into Tony Stark and kind of reimagined him for a new audience, a new generation. And they, now we're at a point where these movies are so influential, they're revamping the comics to match the movies sometimes. Having said that, I think Tom Holland is a very compelling character, and I think he's really nuanced. I think we're only just seeing him start. If he keeps going, if he keeps doing what he's doing, the storyline they have going now, I think, is kind of a new origin. It's like a new starting point for him. I'll leave it there.
I still need to watch those movies. Didn't get the chance to see them in theaters because Sarah hates movies and has forbid me to see them. That's why we're recording this in a bunker in an undisclosed location.
You beat me to it. You knew I was going to say that. Our ongoing actual thing that's happening to me. I get let out once a week to record these podcasts with him. I hope everyone's okay. Okay, so Spider-Man. Yeah. Let's see. Spider-Man's mantra. Where did it come from?
Uncle
Obviously,
Ben.
Stan Lee wrote it. It's not a new thing. With great power, there must also come great responsibility, which isn't really how they repeat it later on. So it's oftentimes attributed to Uncle Ben, except in that first throwaway issue, which they thought wasn't really going to go anywhere, it's just in a narration bubble. square thingy toward the end after he's learned his lesson and has decided to become Spider-Man. They talk about origin stories. Like, Spider-Man's origin story has been done to death, and people say, like, they're tired of seeing it, which is why Marvel listened and just didn't show Uncle Ben's death. They didn't show Spider-Man's origin story. They glossed over all of that. And they were like, it's not going to be that revolutionary or different, so we're just going to skip over it with Tom Holland. I think there should have been a flashback, at least, a small one, at least of Uncle Ben saying something to him, so that they would have had because there isn't a canonical actor playing Uncle Ben at the moment, to have been dead. They could have left him alive for a long time. They could have done something really different. Having said that, they say the same thing of Batman. We've seen Batman's origin way too many times. How many actors can we cast to kill off for those Martha and Batman's dad? He's got a name, I'm sure. I did research for Spider-Man, not Batman, this week. So, with great power, there must also come great responsibility. It wasn't Uncle Ben who originally said it, but they would retcon that in later to have Spider-Man actually reminisce or hallucinate Uncle Ben at times, saying those words to him. They would eventually, I do not know the writer, because it wasn't Stan Lee, to canonize it having been Uncle Ben, that would casually say it from time to time, reminding Peter of that. There was, I think, was that in the first episode of Pete has a flashback, because they don't go over his origin. They kind of jump right in that animated series as well.
It might have been the second or third episode.
Where he, as a kid, I think Uncle Ben says that to him, as if that's one of his things he's reminding him of, because he knows Peter has great intellect. And I think that they did something in his origin with that too, where Doc Ock was like a teacher at some science camp. Yeah, I thought that was a great idea, that he has these connections to these characters, because I don't think he had that same kind of connection in the regular comics.
I don't know about their comics, but I know in other iterations, Peter did have some kind of working relationship with Octavius before he became the Octopus.
So, who's your favorite? I think in all of comic book history, there are two rogues galleries that rival each other. Two superheroes that have the best villains, and I've already mentioned their names just here and now. It's Spider-Man and Batman. A lot of people don't even like Batman comics, Batman movies, but they'll have a tattooed Joker on him in a heartbeat.
Yeah.
Spider-Man's got some great villains.
And that's a hard to pick.
It really is.
Yeah.
There's the original there's something I would like to just touch on briefly. The original version of Venom was meant to be a woman, and they didn't want to do that. I think I mentioned in a previous episode, I actually liked the idea of what they wanted to do with in the Tobey Maguire's third film with Topher Grace being like, but they still bulked him up. Yeah. That was the problem. They still kind of turned him into like a version of Venom. I think they should have left that alone. Let him be just this thin, tall guy, and it be like Nega Spider-Man. Anyway, a lot of them have close ties to him. I think that's something unique like J. Jonah Jameson could be considered a Spider-Man villain too. That's his boss. I mean, most of us have a boss that could be considered a supervillain.
We'll get into Jameson in a little bit, because I got a bit to say. But as far as my favorite villain, that is really tough. And I really kind of like Kingpin.
Yeah.
But I have to say, it's because of the Daredevil that Kingpin really goes.
Oh, yeah.
Because especially Vincent D'Onofrio's portrayal in the Netflix. And did they bring him over into the MCU?
They did.
Yes. That was spot on. Just the nuances was fantastic. But as far as Spider-Man's other villains, I really like the Morbius character, not so much the movie.
Yeah.
You can pick any of the Sinister Six lineups.
So the Scorpion? You like the Scorpion?
I mean, even that's an interesting character.
Yeah.
Because it's just like J. Jonah Jameson, like, what do you want to call it? Naivety?
Yeah.
Well, led stupidity. To that. Yeah. Led to that creation. So even that is like an interesting background.
At some point later on in the comics, I think into the 2000s, Eddie Brock loses the symbiote.
Yeah, and Matt Gargan becomes
it's
Venom.
Like Venom, Scorpion, Venom. Interesting idea.
And then Flash Thompson becomes
Agent Venom.
What I want to see that explored in a movie. I have some of those comic books. I didn't get to finish that run, but just an interesting take.
Yeah, because they worked in he he went off to war, I think in Iraq or Afghanistan.
Yeah, he actually went off twice. The first time he came back with like PTSD or something like that and became an alcoholic. But he got his life together, got it back, and ended up going on another tour where he lost both of his legs.
That's what you get for bullying Peter Parker.
Yeah. And then they call him back in because they're doing experiments with the symbiotes, and they can control it for like a window of time, and they send him on these like Black Ops missions. And where I left off in those comic books is something goes wrong, and so it ended up to stay alive. He had to keep the suit on longer than what was like
advisable.
Yeah, advisable. Yeah. And I never found out how that ended.
Oh no. We'll have to get you a trade paperback.
Yeah.
I don't know myself. I never read that line completely. Some out of continuity characters in the I think it was a PS1 game that I played relentlessly, which was I think post that Spider-Man cartoon show, not based on it, but clearly had an influence on it. Felt like you were playing a cartoon version of that. There is, at the end of the game, you have to fight Doc Ock and then Carnage, I think. And the Carnage symbiote leaves Cletus Cassidy and goes down onto Dr. Octopus. Yeah. And then you don't fight him. You just run. That's the end of the game. And you have to go through this series of tunnels, and he is right behind you. It took me forever. And you can't cheat. There's no cheating in that. You just have to get good enough at like web swinging and like doing that, where you like zip line up to the top or whatever. You just have to learn the pattern. There is no way around it. I eventually was able to do that. It might be the reason why I'm on certain medications these days. But anyway, so that is exclusive. I don't think that has ever happened in the comics or any other iteration. That's exclusive to that game. And actually it's another Carnage. The other thing I wanted to say, maybe my favorite villain is Peter Parker. At the end of the universe they end up in at the end of the series is a universe where things go bad for Peter. Like things go bad for Peter all the time. He's a guy who has real world problems, and some messed up stuff always happens to him. His real superpower is that he keeps getting up, and he is relentless, and he is just an all-around good guy, that he won't let it turn him into a villain. If there's one superhero that life should have turned into a villain, it's Peter Parker. But he doesn't let that happen, except in this one universe. And instead of bonding with the Venom symbiote, he bonded with the Carnage symbiote. And it doesn't go well. And they had to actually go into the multiverse to find somebody to talk sense to him, and it finally shakes him loose. I get emotional just talking about this because it's an epic story. Don't do it for research. Enjoy that show right to its end. I think it's complicated. It does. Just like the Batman animated series. The Batman animated series kept things in digestible bites. I don't think there were a lot of two-parters, if any at all. This one did parts up into the teens or 20s or something. They just kept it going.
It's like the last few seasons was just an ongoing storyline.
Yeah, and I love that. It's like Star Trek The Next Generation. Everything, there were storylines, but for the most part, one-off episodes. It's just an anthology. The next show was Deep Space Nine. First couple seasons, one-offs. They start laying the groundwork for some ongoing storylines, but then past season 3, there are some one-offs there that have nothing to do with the main storyline, but they are just building and building and building this story to the end with the shapeshifters and the Dominion, and it's like the wormhole aliens. It's this whole big thing, and that's why you have people who are like, I'm nostalgic about Next Generation, but Deep Space Nine was such a great overall story with characters that you could still fall in love with, the same as Next Generation. I didn't plan on making this analogy, but my love for that kind of storytelling may have actually come from that Spider-Man, the animated series, which is, I think, the dichotomy between the Batman show, which is great on its own and had some great storytelling, but in one-off stories that are, you could go to any one episode, watch it, especially the Mr. Freeze ones, and say, great, I've watched a thing. I can go do something else. The Spider-Man, you can't really do that in that Spider-Man 90s show because it's so long and drawn out. You turn into some random episode, you could be having Spider-Man turning into a spider monster fighting Morbius, and then Alistair Smythe shows up looking like a monster with these things coming up out of his shoulders, and you're like, what the did I miss? I got to go back and watch 20 other episodes. Well, go back from episode 1 because it's a great show. And I think definitively, I mean, there's so many Spider-Man shows. They're never going to stop making Spider-Man cartoons because it translates so well for kids. But I think that one, people can say I have my 90s nostalgia goggles on because that's when I grew up. Well, you're right. I do.
I mean, yeah, I got the nostalgia goggles on too. But even having been a while since I watched this, it's not like I've had with some other shows where it's just like, yeah, I love that show. You go back and watch it and like, that was garbage.
Yeah.
No, this is still just as entertaining to me had I not watched it as a kid.
Okay, I'm going to say that theme is still awesome. Some people might think it sucked even then, but it was like somehow Brian May from Queen and Joe Perry, and nobody can give me a definitive answer on if they were ever in the same room at the same time, but they're both credited at different points anyway. I'm not sure who played what and where, but somebody from Aerosmith gets a shout out in that show. They get referenced when he gets the Venom symbiote. Like, I could dress like that guy from Aerosmith. It's most likely Steven Tyler, I assume. That's who it's supposed to be, but Joe Perry's worn some outlandish clothing too.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Maybe only second to the X-Men theme.
Yeah, that Spider-Man theme is not going to get referenced anywhere. I just really enjoy it for me, and there's like the talk box, and I think it's a really great intro. The X-Men theme most recently it was in Doctor Strange, The Multiverse of Madness, and it was in Ms. Marvel. Yep, I watched Ms. Marvel, and I liked it. Oh no! The woke mob got to me. They got in my brain. And now I like Indian people. What's that about? It's a good show. And she's a good actress. And kind of reminds me of my girlfriend. And that's not why I liked it. I was going to give this show a chance. I didn't know if I would like it because I'd never read her comics. But it's good. She-Hulk's not great. But Ms. Marvel is. And she might be a mutant. Yeah. Not in the comics, she's an Inhuman, which is weird because she is so far removed from the Inhuman royal family. That's what the Inhumans comics was always about. But technically she was an Inhuman, so I think they're going to just kind of ignore that they've done Inhuman stuff, even though they haven't. Like, the Black Bolt was in Doctor Strange. So I think Ms. Marvel is going to, she might be our first mutant character in the MCU. I don't know.
Does Marvel have the rights to X-Men back now?
They do, yeah. I think that was a done deal about a year ago, and then there were rumors as to like who's going to cameo in what first, because they're going to start laying the groundwork early on, and I think it was technically Professor X in Doctor Strange, and which they had co-ownership of Wanda and Pietro Maximoff, Quicksilver, and Scarlet Witch, because they were such core Avengers characters that the only thing they could agree on is that they could both use them.
They just couldn't be mutants.
Yeah, so that was their caveat, is that they wouldn't say that buzzword. They're mutants. They're special beings with these weird magic powers, and they tied it to the Infinity Stones. So to the extent that this stuff is going to be retconned, because basically now Wanda's like just a magic wielder, and they've kind of like, yeah, she's magical. She does magic stuff. Before they leaned into that, it was kind of just Jean Grey reskinned. Yeah. Except without the overt telepathic abilities, but it was mostly just telekinesis for the most part. But now they've leaned into it also being magic, and she's got the Darkhold, a magic book of the damned or something. I don't know. So, also, Spider-Man was bitten by a radioactive spider, which gives him his spider abilities. And I think, just to tie this all in a nice, neat bow, in Miles's universe, at least in the movie version, which I love his hair. Like in the comics, he always kind of had a buzz cut. Like he always kept his hair like real flat. I love his hair in the movies. I don't think they got this design like perfect, at least for him. I don't know who ever said it, maybe even Matt Groening, but like if you have a character that you can recognize from their silhouette, that is the mark of a great character. Almost every Futurama and Simpsons character you can recognize from their silhouette. Without Miles's mask on, when you can see his hair, you could recognize his silhouette easily. Anyway, in that universe, Spider-Man was a real character. Peter Parker existed and was their Spider-Man. Then he dies and Miles takes over. But they made comic books of him. And the first issue that you see a revamped version of the Amazing Fantasy origin. And Miles goes through his own version of that when his spider powers start to kick in. I thought that was a great Easter egg reference, especially for kids who'd never seen that or read a replica of it. Yeah. Obviously, they're not going to have their hands on an original, but it's been reprinted several times. So
unless that kid's got some serious money.
Yeah. Well, not all of us have that Baron Trump money. So yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing where Spider-Man pops up next, and any iteration of Spider-Man. I think Miles. We didn't focus on Miles in this one because we're going to be talking about him in our review for into Across the Spider-Verse, and then Beyond the Spider-Verse coming out next year in March.
But we said we'd get back to JJ.
Oh yeah. You had something for that.
First of all, let's just say J.K. Simmons' casting
perfect
was the perfect casting. There is no other J. Jonah in my mind. But looking at the character of Jameson, I mean, obviously hates Spider-Man, goes out of his way to ruin Spider-Man's name, even creates the Scorpion to get rid of Spider-Man. But even though he doesn't like always show it, he's always had Peter's back. Like even in the movies, like he refused to tell where Peter is. Mm-hmm. Like, and throughout different things, like he has done things to help Peter, even in the middle of him yelling at Peter about being the worst photographer ever, and then buying all the pictures. I don't know where else I was going with this.
Was it that his son's a werewolf?
Oh, yeah. That was another thing that I want to see explored. Off topic, but you reminded me. In one of the Spider-Man cartoons, I think it's Ultimate Spider-Man. In that version, Spider-Man works for S.H.I.E.L.D. as part of a group with like Nova. I think Power Man's there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Iron Fist and White Tiger. At some point, they end up working with Fury's Howling Commandos, which is a strike force made up of monster people. Is John Jameson one of those?
I don't know. I didn't see that episode or that storyline in that. That was a good show, and I remember watching a good chunk of it, but I never finished it, and I don't remember that one. So that's interesting.
Yes. Ever since I watched that episode, and they've been talking about bringing Blade into the MCU, I'm like, I want to see Blade lead the Howling Commandos in a movie or one of their one-shots, what ifs or whatever. I just want to see it.
The Werewolf by Night was pretty sweet. That might be a Halloween mainstay for me every year. I love Gael Bernal. You know what? I don't know. I love that actor. He was amazing in Michel Gondry's The Science of Sleep. He's good in everything he does. I've been avoiding Old, the one of Shyamalan's most recent works. He starred in that. I'm mentioning his work so that anybody who actually knows what his name is, Gael. Yeah, I'm going to trip over it. I'm going to sound like an idiot. Just bleep me saying all that, and people can just think that I was making another Hitler joke. Hitler's stupid and a vegan. Vegans aren't stupid.
Yeah, and to clarify, anyone that listened to the previous episode, the Hitler joke was that there was no joke.
Yeah, but if you created a joke in your head and it was actually good for you. That was your secret assignment. So, okay, so Clearly they know J. Jonah Jameson is perfectly cast as J.K. Simmons because they've continued that on for quite a while now, and they're not going to let that. I think even in some audio-only roles, it's been him since then.
I'm pretty sure he's voiced the character in some of the video games.
His son is an astronaut werewolf. Comics are weird. And so let's hope they dip into some monster stuff coming up. The Marvel Comics is so big and weird that it's got room for everything. Dracula is a canonical character in Marvel Comics.
Yes.
So,
which that always seemed weird to me. How is it we can have Dracula as the canonical character, but we can't come out and call Morbius a vampire?
So like in that cartoon, it was the same reason.
Well, I think in the cartoon they just carried on what was in the comic books.
Yeah, and I think that was because of the comics code at the time.
Yeah,
like
you couldn't mention like the undead.
Yeah,
so he's a living vampire.
And then they took it to another extreme when it came to that cartoon because he had to have like
plasma
instead of
blood,
and he had the suckers on his hand, which I always thought, that's pretty weird. It's kind of original though.
Yeah.
I don't know of any other vampire version of any vampires that do that. Also, it's kind of more dangerous. Like, have you ever like dealt with a dog that was trying to bite you? And it's like, you have to keep this one thing away from you. But if you were trying to keep the dog's paws from sucking plasma out of you, how hard would that be? I mean, they'd be all over you. So anyway, I never minded that. If people were like, oh, this is stupid, he's a vampire, his nose is turned up, he's supposed to be like sucking blood and being all edgy. Not you can't have it all. And that's where sometimes writers can make the best out of censorship. I hate censorship. I don't agree with it, even though I'm actively telling you to censor me in this to make me sound like I haven't forgotten everything or I'm having some sort of mental breakdown. I generally don't like it when it comes to art.
Yes, I don't agree either, but I'm still hoping YouTube will eventually pay me. So censor train it is.
Censorship all the way. Okay, I wanted to try and end this on the werewolf note, but then I just kept talking. You got anything else that like Spider-Man related? What were you gonna say about Triple J?
I don't know. I thought I had more, but no, it's like him being the more nuanced character than just yelling about Spider-Man.
Yeah.
And also like that whole dynamic being like confusing as a kid. Because it's just like, being a reporter sounds pretty cool. It's like Spider-Man's a reporter, Superman's a reporter. And it's just like, no, that job sucks. It's like there's no money in it unless you're JJ and you own the news.
Yeah.
And then there's money. It's like, how is this just news guy got these millions of dollars?
Yeah. And you know what? Robbie Robertson, I do want to mention, that's another, I think, Stanley alliterative named character.
Of course.
He would always stand up to J. Jonah Jameson and say and support Spider-Man as a hero, and was a main character in that cartoon. They didn't get into like the Spider-Man comics had like a huge cast of like main characters that each had their own storylines that were usually pretty hardcore and devastating on an emotional level, and that were directly tied back to Peter Parker. Anyway, Robbie Robertson, probably one of the most underrated background characters that were related to Peter Parker, and were a huge supporter of Spider-Man and also to Peter at the Daily Planet, the Daily Bugle. You mentioned Clark Kent a minute ago. It messed me up.
Spider-Man's a better character than Superman. I'll stand by that.
I agree. So, want to call it a day?
Yeah, before we get even more off track.
I think this one was easier to stay on track with because Spider-Man is a broad character. I was able to use a lot of other references as analogies and kind of stay. Also, I wrote down bullet points, which helped, but not a lot.
And as always, I was watching cartoons. And with that, we'll end our show. If you made it this far, thank you. Be sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram. Links will be in the description below. Remember to keep an eye out for our movie review show that will be debuting soon. And if you want to help out the show, like, subscribe, leave a comment, and tell all your friends. And heck, even tell your enemies. We'll take it. And if you really want to support the show, we do have a Patreon. And until next time, farewell.